Officer had seen his fair share of horror in his 10 years on the force. Drug busts gone wrong, domestic disputes that turned deadly, even the occasional suicide cleanup. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare him for what he was about to face. It was a bitterly cold autumn night, the kind where the wind carried whispers through the alleys, making even the most hardened criminals retreat into their homes. Carter sat in his patrol car, parked at a 24-hour diner, sipping on stale coffee. Beside him, his loyal canine partner, Shadow, lay curled up, his dark fur blending into the shadows of the vehicle. The radio crackled to life. Unit 417, we have a report of possible distress at 607 Willow Lane. Neighbors claim they heard children crying from inside the abandoned house. No known occupants, please respond. Carter furrowed his brow. Willow Lane? He knew that place. Everyone did. It was the house nobody talked about, the one parents warned their kids about, the one that had stood empty for decades, yet somehow never truly felt abandoned. There were stories, of course, whispers of missing persons, murmurs of voices in the night. He glanced at Shadow, who had perked up, ears twitching. Dogs always sense things before humans did. Carter exhaled, grabbing the radio. Copy that, dispatch. 417 en route. He put the car in drive. 1.2, the house that breathed. Pulling up to 607 Willow Lane, Carter felt his stomach tighten. The house loomed over the street like a decayed corpse. The windows were black voids, the wooden panels rotting and warped, yet the structure stood as if it were alive, breathing, waiting. He stepped out of the car and immediately Shadow began to growl, not the usual warning growl. This was different, deep, guttural, almost unnatural. Carter reached for his flashlight, shining it on the front porch. The wood creaked beneath his boots as he stepped forward. Shadow hesitated but followed, tail stiff. He knocked 1, 2, 3 times. Silence, and then a sound, a child's whisper, just behind the door. Help us. Carter's breath hitched. The voice was weak, fragile, but something was wrong. It wasn't the pleading of a terrified child. It was hollow, distant, like an echo of something long gone. He reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold. The door creaked open on its own. 1.3, the blood on the walls. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The walls were peeling, furniture overturned as if someone had left in a hurry. The only source of light came from Carter's flashlight, casting long, unsettling shadows. Shadow stepped inside cautiously, nose twitching, hackles raised. Then the dog froze. His body stiffened, eyes wide. His breathing became rapid. Carter followed Shadow's gaze to the far end of the room. His flashlight landed on the wall, and the words smeared across it in dark, dripping red. No one leaves. Blood. And it was fresh. Carter's grip tightened around his flashlight. The house had been abandoned for years. Who the hell wrote this? Then, a loud thud upstairs, like something heavy hitting the floor. Shadow barked wildly, snapping his teeth at nothing. Carter's pulse quickened. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I need backup at 607 Willow Lane. Possible intruder. Request immediate. Static. The radio screeched, cutting in and out until a single voice whispered through the white noise. You shouldn't have come. Carter's blood ran cold. Then Shadow whimpered, tail between his legs, backing away from the stairs. Something was coming. 1.4, the thing that wasn't there. The footsteps were slow. Deliberate. Each one creaked the wood above. Carter raised his gun. Police! Show yourself! Silence. Then a giggle. A child's giggle. But something about it was wrong. It echoed from multiple directions at once, as if there were several children whispering at the same time. Carter felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. Shadow whined, shrinking back toward the door. He had never seen the dog like this, not even during shootouts. He took a deep breath and started up the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. Halfway up, a cold gust of air blew past him, carrying the stench of something rotten. Then, he saw it. At the top of the stairs, standing in the shadows, was a small figure. A child. Their face was obscured, nothing but a dark blur where eyes should be. And yet, Carter felt them staring right at him. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, the child whispered, "You brought a dog." The air in the room dropped. Before Carter could react, Shadow yelped in pain. Spinning around, Carter saw something dragging the dog toward the basement door. But there was nothing there, just Shadow, claws digging into the wood, eyes wide with terror, being pulled by an unseen force. Carter lunged forward, grabbing Shadow's collar. He pulled with all his strength. Then the basement door slammed shut, and everything went silent. 1.5. The recording. For a long moment, Carter just stood there, breathing heavily. Shadow was shaking violently, his fur damp with sweat. He refused to move. Carter's hands trembled as he reached for his radio again. Dispatch, I need static, but this time something else came through. A recording. It was a voice, grainy and old, like it had been played 1,000 times before. They took my dog first, then they took me. A pause, then a single child's laugh, and the line went dead. Chapter 2, 2.1, Trapped in the House That Breathed. Carter stood frozen, his breath shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. The radio had gone silent. The words it had just whispered back to him, "They took my dog first, then they took me," still lingered in his ears, like an echo that refused to fade. Shadow trembled at his feet, his usual fearless stance now replaced with something Carter had never seen before. Pure, unfiltered terror. The dog's tail was tucked so tightly between his legs it almost disappeared into his fur, and his ears lay flat against his skull. Something wasn't right, and Carter's instincts screamed at him to leave. He reached for the doorknob, locked. He twisted harder. The knob wouldn't budge. With a grunt, he slammed his shoulder into the door, but it was as if the wood itself had grown roots, anchoring it in place. The house was holding them inside. Shadow let out a soft, pitiful whimper. Carter turned, his flashlight beam flickering as he scanned the room. The wall where blood had been smeared earlier was now clean. No words, no trace of red. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing against his skin. And then, a voice, a whisper so faint it was barely audible. Downstairs. Carter stiffened. The whisper hadn't come from his radio, it had come from inside the room. His flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker, struggling to pierce the shadows. And then, just for a second, he saw something. A shape. Standing at the far end of the living room, a small childlike figure, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if its neck had been twisted too far. Then it vanished. Carter's blood ran cold. He tightened his grip on his flashlight and gun, his voice hoarse. "Who's there?" Silence. Shadow let out a low, guttural growl, his hackles rising. His eyes were locked onto the basement door. And that's when Carter saw it. The door was open now. A staircase led down into pure darkness. 2.2, The Descent into Darkness. Carter didn't want to go down there, but he had no choice. The front door was locked. The windows wouldn't break. The only way out was through. He took a deep breath, lifted his gun, and stepped forward. Shadow hesitated at the top of the stairs, ears twitching. "Come on, buddy," Carter whispered. The dog whimpered, but obeyed, following closely behind. Step by step, Carter descended, the wooden stairs creaking under his weight. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The air reeked of mold and something else, something foul. His flashlight flickered, then it went out, pitch black. He smacked the side of the flashlight, but it refused to turn back on. That's when he heard it, the sound of bare feet running across the concrete. Fast, too fast. And it was coming toward him. Carter's pulse skyrocketed. He blindly whipped his gun around, finger tensing on the trigger. And then the feet stopped, right in front of him. A faint giggle echoed in the dark. Shadow snapped his jaws violently at nothing, barking so fiercely that saliva sprayed into the air. And just like that, the flashlight flickered back on. There was nothing there, just the empty basement. But Carter knew better. They weren't alone. Not 2.3, the video recorder. The basement was small, bare concrete walls, wooden beams stretching across the ceiling. But one thing stood out. In the center of the room, a chair sat perfectly upright. And on the chair, a video recorder. Carter hesitated, then stepped closer. Dust covered the device, but it was still turned on, its red recording light blinking. He reached out and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, static. Then a dark figure appeared on screen. A man, bound to the chair, his head hanging forward. His chest rose and fell in frantic, uneven breaths. A voice came from behind the camera. "Tell them what happens if they don't listen." The man on the screen shook his head violently. "Please," he sobbed, "don't make me." A loud crack like bones snapping. The man screamed, his body convulsing. Then his arms began to bend, but not normally. His elbows snapped backward. His legs twisted the wrong way. A voice whispered from the recorder, "Your turn." The screen glitched. And then Carter saw himself on the screen. Him, standing in the basement, watching the video, and behind him, a black figure, watching him right now. 2.4, the cold hand. Carter spun around, gun raised, empty, but the second he turned, a hand, ice cold, grabbed his wrist. He jerked back, but no one was there. A whisper brushed against his ear. "They see you now?" The lights in the basement exploded, glass shattering to the floor. Shadow yelped and lunged, snapping at something invisible. And then the basement door slammed shut. Pitch black again. Carter heard the soft sound of children laughing. Then one final whisper, "Run!" And the screaming began. Not his, not Shadow's, but something below them. Something waiting in the dark. 9 Unit, Chapter 3, The Whispering Graves. 3.1, the darkness closes in. Carter stood frozen in the pitch-black basement, gripping his gun so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, his heart hammering against his ribs. The whispers had stopped, but the presence remained. Shadow whimpered beside him, his body tense, fur bristling. The dog's ears were pinned back, his teeth bared, his tail tucked so far between his legs it nearly touched his belly. Carter had never seen his partner this terrified before. Then a soft scratching sound, not from the walls, not from the ceiling, but beneath them. Carter's stomach twisted. He swallowed hard and forced his flashlight toward the floor. The concrete looked cracked, uneven, almost like something had been disturbed. And then, right before his eyes, the cracks widened. The scratching grew louder, frenzied. Something was digging from underneath. Carter took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But then, a soft voice drifted up through the cracks. "Help me." Carter's spine went rigid. The voice was fragile, weak, and undeniably human. He shouldn't respond. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to ignore it. But the cop in him, the part of him that had sworn to protect and serve, couldn't just turn away. He tightened his grip on his gun. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a sharp, agonized scream. It was coming from inside the ground. Carter's blood turned ice cold. Shadow snapped his head up, his eyes darting toward the far side of the basement. Carter followed his gaze, and what he saw made his breath hitch. The wall was bleeding. Thick, dark liquid oozed from the cracks in the cement, snaking down like veins, and in the center of it, fingernail marks, as if someone had been dragged into the wall. Then the basement light flickered back on, and standing in the corner was a man, Yan. 3.2, the man in the shadows. Carter jerked his gun up, finger on the trigger. "Freeze! Hands where I can see them." The man didn't move. He stood completely still, half shrouded in shadows. His body was thin, too thin, his limbs longer than they should be. His clothes were tattered, his skin gray and sunken like he'd been rotting for years. Then he lifted his head, his eyes were completely black, and he smiled. Carter's stomach lurched. Then the man spoke. You shouldn't have come." His voice was wrong. It was layered, like multiple people were speaking at once. Then without warning, he rushed forward. Carter fired. Once, twice. The bullets ripped through the man's chest. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he laughed, a high-pitched, unnatural laugh that made Carter's skin crawl. And then he vanished. Not into the shadows, not behind anything. He just blinked out of existence. Carter's breath came fast, panic rising in his throat. Then Shadow let out a terrified yelp. Carter whipped around. The basement floor was collapsing inward, and something was crawling out. Dresser 3.3, the hands that reached. The floor split open, revealing a gaping black pit, and from within it, hands began clawing their way up, rotting, bony fingers, dozens of them, reaching, grasping, pulling themselves free from the darkness. Carter took a step back, his stomach twisting in horror. Then he saw their faces, sunken, hollow, twisted in agony. Some had their mouths frozen in a silent scream. Others had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets that oozed black liquid, and they were climbing toward him. Carter's grip on his gun tightened. "Stay back!" he shouted. But the dead don't listen. The first corpse-like figure dragged itself free, its limbs twitching unnaturally, its jaw hung open too wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. It lunged. Shadow snapped his teeth, biting into the thing's arm, but his jaws passed right through it. The thing didn't even notice. Carter fired point blank. The bullet ripped through the creature's head, and yet it kept moving. Its head snapped back into place as if the bullet had done nothing at all. Then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 souls whispering at once, it spoke. "Join us." Carter grabbed Shadow by the collar and ran. 3.4, the escape that wasn't. Carter bolted up the basement stairs, Shadow right beside him. The second he reached the door, he slammed into it full force. Still locked. Carter's chest heaved, his hands trembled as he rattled the doorknob, yanking it so hard his fingers burned. The whispers behind him grew louder, Shadow pressing against Carter's leg. Then a voice right behind his ear. "Let us in." Carter spun and saw himself, standing at the bottom of the stairs, same uniform, same badge, same face, but its eyes were black holes, and it was smiling. It tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then, in Carter's own voice, it whispered, "We need a new body." Then, it charged up the stairs. Carter didn't think. He kicked the door with everything he had. It burst open. He and Shadow stumbled out, slamming it shut behind them. Then, silence. The whispers were gone. The basement was quiet. Carter stood there, gasping, sweat dripping down his face. Then he looked down and realized something horrifying. Shadow was staring at him. Not with fear, but with recognition. Like he was looking at something that wasn't Carter anymore. Then, for the first time in years, Shadow growled at him. Deep, low, like he was looking at a stranger, a thing wearing Carter's skin. And in that moment, Carter felt it too. A slow creeping wrongness inside him, like something had followed him out, and it was still inside. The cursed canine unit. Chapter 4, The Passenger Inside. 4.1, the ride home wasn't normal. Carter gripped the steering wheel, his fingers trembling. The air inside the squad car felt heavy, wrong, like something unseen was sitting in the backseat watching him. Shadow sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his ears pinned back, his body tense. His deep, low growl never stopped, not for a second. Something was still with them. Carter swallowed hard and forced himself to ignore the growing unease. Maybe he was just shaken. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe, tick, tick, tick. A faint sound echoed in the car, like fingernails tapping against glass. Carter's hands clenched tighter. He glanced at the rearview mirror. At first, nothing, just the empty back seat. But then, a shape shifted in the darkness. Carter's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat. The mirror was warping. His own reflection wasn't moving right. The way his head turned, the way his chest rose and fell, it was off by a fraction of a second. And then, in the reflection, his own face smiled. But Carter wasn't smiling. 4.2, something is inside him. The squad car swerved violently. Carter snapped his head away from the mirror, gripping the wheel. The tires screeched against the road as he struggled to regain control. Shadow barked, snarling at the mirror. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. He took a shaky breath. Maybe he was just seeing things. He was exhausted, sleep-deprived. Maybe, "You let me out." Carter's throat went dry. The voice was inside his head. Cold, hollow, and it was his own voice. "You let me out, and now I need a home." Carter's stomach twisted. He yanked the car to the side of the road, skidding to a stop. The moment the tires stopped moving, he flung the door open and stumbled out, gasping. Shadow jumped out beside him, fur bristling. The night air was freezing, but Carter's skin was burning hot. He felt wrong, like something was moving inside him, A slow, crawling sensation just beneath his skin. Something was shifting, like he was a suit being worn by something else. 4.3, the voices don't stop. Carter pressed his hands against his face, breathing hard. His fingers were ice cold. Shadow whined beside him. The world felt distant, unreal. The distant hum of the streetlights, the rustling wind, the sound of Shadow's breathing, it all felt off. Then in the silence, "Why is your dog afraid of you?" Carter's body stiffened. That wasn't his thought. His breathing quickened. He closed his eyes. "Do you feel it?" He did. "It's spreading, Carter." Carter's hands shook. He clenched his teeth. "No," he whispered. "Your body is just a shell." "Shut up. We just needed someone to wear." "Shut up!" Carter roared. His own voice echoed back at him, but it wasn't alone. It was layered, distorted, like something else was speaking with him. Shadow backed away from him. Carter's chest heaved. His dog, his loyal partner, was afraid of him. And deep inside, he knew why. In Order 4.4, the truth in the mirror. Carter forced himself to breathe, to get back in the car, to drive home. Shadow sat in the backseat now, his eyes never leaving Carter. The entire way home, he didn't blink once. Carter pulled into his driveway and cut the engine. The house was silent, dark, but something felt off, like someone was already inside. Slowly, he stepped inside, Shadow following close behind. The moment he flicked on the lights, every single mirror in the house shattered. The explosion of glass was instant. Carter flinched, shielding his face. Shadow barked wildly, spinning in circles. Then, silence. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned his head slowly, and that's when he saw it. One mirror hadn't broken. The hallway mirror. Carter stared into it. His reflection stood there, staring back. Then it blinked, but Carter hadn't blinked. His chest turned to ice. Then his reflection smiled. Slow, unnatural, wrong smile. And in a voice that was both his own and not his own, it whispered, "Your body belongs to me now." To be continued in Chapter 5. Carter is no longer alone in unit. Chapter 5, The Thing in the Mirror, 5.1, A Stranger in His Own Skin. Carter stood motionless in front of the mirror, his breath shallow. His reflection shouldn't have moved on its own. But there it was, grinning at him. A slow, stretched, unnatural grin. His own face, his own body, but something else was inside it. "Let me in completely, Carter." The voice slithered through his mind, cold and invasive. Carter staggered back, his head throbbing. His vision blurred for a second, the walls of his home seeming to warp and shift. His body stiff, his teeth bared. His fur stood on end, his hackles raised. Then, Carter's own reflection stepped forward. His stomach dropped. It shouldn't have been able to do that, but the Carter in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was leaving the glass, and it was coming for him. 5.2, It wears his skin like a suit. Carter stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The reflection, or whatever it was, stepped out of the mirror completely, standing in front of him. It looked identical to him. Same uniform, same scars. But the eyes were wrong. Black pits, endless and hungry. Shadow lunged, barking furiously, but the thing wearing Carter's face didn't react. Instead, it tilted its head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," it whispered. Then it raised its hand. Carter froze. His own body started moving against his will. His arms twitched, his fingers curled, his legs tensed. It was like his body wasn't his anymore. The thing was taking control. "You don't need to fight, Carter," the voice rasped. "Just let me in." Carter gritted his teeth, fighting back. Shadow whined, then barked sharply, and suddenly, the thing flinched. Carter felt the control snap back to him. He gasped, collapsing to the floor. His heart pounded, his head ached. The thing stared at Shadow. Then its smile widened. "Oh, you're the problem, aren't you?" And then it lunged at the dog. The 5.3, The Battle for Carter's soul. Carter reacted instantly. He grabbed the first thing within reach, a heavy metal lamp, and swung. Crack! The thing stumbled back, hissing. Its form glitched, flickering between Carter's face and something else, something rotten, decomposed, hollow. Shadow snarled and lunged again, his jaws snapping shut inches from the creature's arm. The thing screeched, its voice layered with 1,000 whispers. It jerked backward, twisting unnaturally, its limbs bending the wrong way. Then it turned to Carter. And this time its voice was angry. "You can't keep me out forever." Then it vanished. 5.4, it's still inside him. Silence. Carter stood there, chest heaving. The thing was gone. But he knew the truth. It wasn't really gone. It was still inside him, waiting, watching, and next time, it might win. Shadow pressed against Carter's leg, whining softly. Carter looked down at his partner, his only true ally. His grip tightened. No, he wouldn't let this thing take him. He had to fight, and the only way to win was to go back to where it all started. The abandoned house, the cursed basement. He had to end this. He had to end this. For good. Unit. Chapter 6, The House That Breathes. 6.1, A Pact with the Dark. Carter gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The haunted house loomed in the distance, barely visible through the thick fog curling over the road. His body felt wrong, like it wasn't his anymore. The thing inside him was waiting, watching, smiling. Shadow sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his ears pinned back, his body, he knew. This wasn't just a haunted house anymore. It was a trap, a graveyard that hadn't been marked. Turn around. The voice slithered through Carter's head, cold and hungry. Don't go back there, Carter. You'll never leave. Carter's jaw clenched. He pushed the voice away. He had to end this before it ended him. Now, 6.2, The House is Alive. The moment Carter stepped out of the car, everything changed. The air thickened, pressing against him like invisible hands. The house breathed. The wooden panels groaned, shifting under his weight. The front door swung open on its own. Inviting him in, Shadow refused to move. His paws dug into the dirt, his body trembling. Carter turned to his partner. "Stay," he whispered. Shadow let out a low, desperate whine. Then Carter stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind him. 6.3, Coast the whispers in the walls, darkness swallowed him whole. The air smelled of rot. Something moved in the shadows. Carter's heartbeat pounded in his skull. He reached for his flashlight. Click! The beam flickered on and illuminated the walls. They were covered in scratches, desperate, clawed markings, and then they moved. The scratches shifted, rearranging into words. Carter's breath caught in his throat. The wall read, "You let it in." His stomach twisted. A wet, choking sound echoed from deeper inside the house. A child's laughter followed, and then the floorboards caved beneath his feet. 6.4, The Thing That Wears His Face. Carter hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through his ribs. He gasped, pushing himself up, and froze. Something stood in front of him. It looked exactly like him, but its head twitched, its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes were empty pits. "You never left this house, Carter." The words slithered out in his own voice. "You died here." Carter's blood ran cold. No, that wasn't true. Was it? His head pounded. The memories of that night, the basement, the missing children, the horrible screams blurred. "Give in." Carter staggered back. The thing stepped forward. Its shadow stretched unnaturally. "Give in." The walls groaned. The air thickened. Scart. The house was closing in, and Carter felt himself slipping. He wasn't alone in his own skin anymore, and this time, the thing inside him wouldn't let go. Chapter 7, The Reflection That Breathes. 7.1, The House is in His Blood. Carter's lungs burned as he gasped for breath. The thing that wore his face stepped closer. Its movements weren't human. Every step cracked and twisted, its body like brittle bones breaking. Shadow barked furiously from outside, scratching at the door. Carter tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. His body was heavy, weak, like something inside him was draining him. "You were always meant to stay here, Carter." The voice came from behind him. He turned and saw another version of himself. This one was decayed, rotting, hollow, its skin peeled in places, its eyes leaked black sludge. "You've been here before, you never really left." Carter's mind spun. Was that true? No, it couldn't be. But his memories blurred. Hadn't he always felt off? Hadn't his reflection always felt a second too slow? Had he ever left this house at all? His stomach turned, and then the mirror behind him shattered. 7.2, the hands that pull him under. Carter stumbled as the shards of glass floated in the air. They didn't fall, they hovered. Then they turned to face him. Each jagged piece reflected something. Not him, not his real face, but other versions of him. Some were twisted, some were burned, some had no faces at all. And then the shadows moved. Hands, too many hands, crawled out of the darkness. They were reaching for him, grabbing at his arms, his neck, his mouth, dragging him down. He tried to fight, but they were stronger. The floor wasn't solid anymore. It was swallowing him. You belong here now, Carter. And then everything went black. 7.3, Shadow's desperate cry. A sudden, sharp bark. Carter's consciousness snapped back. His body was still sinking into the floor, but something changed. Shadow's bark was closer. Then, scraping, clawing, and then the sound of breaking wood. The door burst open. Cold night air rushed in, and Shadow, his loyal partner, charged inside. The dog lunged at the shadows, snapping his jaws. The hands recoiled. The black sludge hissed. For the first time, the house seemed afraid. Shadow grabbed Carter's sleeve, pulling. His teeth sank into the fabric, dragging him back to reality. The hands screeched. The house groaned. The illusion was breaking. Carter gasped, and suddenly he could move again. 7.4, running from the house that breathes. Carter didn't hesitate. He grabbed Shadow and ran. The walls twisted. The hallway stretched longer and longer, endless. The door was right there. But the house was shifting, moving it farther away. The shadows howled, "Stay!" A voice screamed from inside the walls. A child's laughter mixed with cries, but Carter ignored it. He ran harder. Shadow snarled, pushing forward, and they reached the door. Carter threw his weight against it. The wood gave way. And then they were outside. The cold bit into his skin. The moment his feet hit the ground, the house let out a deep, wheezing breath. Then, silence. The house stopped shifting. The whispers vanished. But Carter knew it was still watching, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The Cursed Canine Unit. Chapter 8, The Hunger That Follows. 8.1, The Voice in His Blood. Carter and Shadow sat inside the squad car, parked on the deserted road just outside the cursed house. The cold night air pressed against the windows, thick with unnatural silence. Shadow lay panting on the passenger seat, his body tense, his eyes never leaving Carter, because Carter was shaking. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but because something inside him was still moving. The house might have let him go, but it wasn't done with him. "You still belong to me, Carter." The voice slithered through his skull like a knife dragging through flesh. His fingers twitched. His own breath felt foreign. His skin too tight. Like he was wearing someone else's body. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his nails dug into the leather. No, he wouldn't let this thing take him. He had to fight. The shadow that walks behind him. Carter drove without knowing where he was going. The town was empty this late at night, streetlights flickering as if the darkness itself was feeding off them. Shadow sat upright now, ears alert. The dog sensed it too. They weren't alone. Something was following them. Carter checked the rearview mirror, and his stomach twisted. There was a figure in the backseat. No, not just a figure. It was him, his own face, staring back at him. A smile stretched across its lips, too wide, too unnatural. "Where are you taking me, Carter?" Carter's breath hitched. His own reflection was talking to him. Shadow snarled, his body pressed against the door. Carter slammed the brakes. Screech! The car skidded, tires screaming against the asphalt. When Carter turned around, the backseat was empty, but the smell of rotting flesh still lingered. 3, the rot in his skin. Carter stumbled out of the car, his breath heavy. The cold air did nothing to stop the burning inside his body. Shadow jumped out behind him, his tail stiff, his muscles tense. The street was silent, too silent. Then a noise, a wet, slithering, crawling sound. Carter turned toward the sidewalk, and his heart stopped. His shadow wasn't his own anymore. It was moving. Not like a normal shadow, but like a living, breathing thing. It twitched unnaturally, glitching. Then it turned its head to look at him, and smiled. "You're not real, Carter." Carter staggered back. His hands trembled. Shadow barked furiously, snapping at the ground, but the shadow only stretched taller and taller, until it wasn't a shadow anymore, until it was something else. Something that was wearing his face. And then it lunged. 8.4, it wants to become him. Carter hit the ground hard, his vision spinning. The thing crawled over him, its hands pressing into his chest. It felt like ice and rot, like something dead trying to crawl inside his skin. Shadow snarled and attacked, his teeth sinking into the thing's arm. It let out a horrible, inhuman shriek, but it didn't let go of Carter. "Give in." The voice was in his head again, louder now, desperate. "Just let me in, Carter." Carter's body wasn't his anymore. His fingers twitched on their own. His own heartbeat felt distant. His eyes burned. And for a second, he saw something he shouldn't have. A memory that wasn't his. A dark basement, a child crying, a police badge covered in blood, and a whisper. "You were here before," Carter screamed, and then everything went black. Chapter 9, The Dead Remember Everything. 9.1, Waking in the Dark. Carter's head throbbed as he regained consciousness. His body felt cold, too cold, like he'd been lying in a grave. His eyelids flickered open. Darkness. Not the comforting kind, not the kind that comes with night. This darkness was alive, moving, breathing. It pressed against his skin like invisible fingers, whispering things he wasn't meant to hear. Shadow. Where was Shadow? Carter tried to move, but his body wasn't listening. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. And then a voice scraped against his skull. "You're finally home, Carter." 9.2, The Basement That Shouldn't Exist. Carter's fingers twitched. He forced himself to sit up, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His eyes adjusted, and his stomach dropped. He wasn't on the street anymore. He was in a basement. A basement he recognized because he'd been here before. The same damp concrete, the same rusted pipes dripping thick black sludge, the same chains bolted into the walls. His hands trembled. No, this place was burned down. No, Carter, you burned the house, but not the memory. Carter's breath hitched, and then he heard it. A child's voice. A broken, choked sob. Carter turned, his pulse pounding, and saw a boy standing in the corner. Monitor shot 9.3, The Boy Who Never Left. The boy's skin was gray, sickly, his eyes sunken, hollow. But Carter knew him. His name sat at the edge of his tongue like a rusted blade. Danny. The boy sniffled. Then slowly he lifted his head. Carter froze. Because Danny's face was wrong. His mouth stretched too wide, his lips stitched together with black thread. His empty eye sockets wept black tears. Carter's pulse roared in his ears. "You left me here, Carter." The boy's voice wasn't his own. It was a chorus, 100 whispers speaking as one. "You let him take me." Carter staggered back. "No, that's not true. I tried to save you." The chains on the wall rattled violently. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the darkness behind Danny shifted. Something else was there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't human. 9.4, The Thing That Wears a Badge. The shadows behind Danny split open, and something crawled out. It was tall, twisted. Its arms were too long, its fingers too sharp, and it was wearing a police uniform. Carter's uniform. The badge gleamed dully on its chest, the name scratched away, but its face, it didn't have one, just a smooth, featureless mask of flesh. Until it opened its mouth, a deep, rattling voice oozed from within. "You took an oath, Officer Carter, to serve, to protect." Its head snapped sideways, bones cracking. "But you failed." Carter staggered back, shaking his head. No, this isn't real. Do you remember what you did, Carter?" The thing moved closer. and suddenly it wasn't wearing his face anymore. It was wearing Danny's. His hollow, stitched mouth opened and screamed. 9.5. Now the truth crawls back. Carter fell to his knees, clutching his head. The scream ripped through his skull. Memories flooded back. Blood on his hands. A locked door. Danny screaming, begging, and Carter turning away. Tried to save him. No, the basement walls shuddered. The chains snapped loose, clattering to the ground. Danny stepped forward. His stitched lips tore open, black sludge spilling down his chin. You let him take me, Carter, and now he's coming for you. The shadowy figure lurched forward. Its clawed fingers reached for Carter's throat, and then a deafening gunshot. 9.6. Shadow never left him. The darkness ripped apart. Carter gasped as the pressure lifted. The figure reeled back, shrieking, and standing in the doorway was Shadow. The dog's eyes blazed. His fur bristled, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. A gun smoked in Carter's shaking hands. He didn't remember pulling the trigger. The shadow lurched and twisted, shrieking as cracks split through its body. Danny's face melted away. The police uniform crumbled into nothing. And then the thing collapsed into itself. Gone. The basement shuddered. The walls began to crack. It was falling apart. Shadow rushed to Carter's side, nudging him desperately. Move. Carter forced himself to his feet. His legs screamed in protest, but he ran. He ran up the crumbling stairs. He ran through the rotting doorway. And as soon as his feet hit the outside world, the house behind him collapsed into darkness, and then silence. At Chapter 10, The Debt That Never Dies. 10.1, The night isn't over. Carter stumbled onto the pavement, gasping for air. His hands shook violently, his head spinning. The cursed house behind him was gone, collapsed into nothing but dust and rot. For a moment he thought it was over, but then Shadow growled lowly, his fur bristling. Carter turned, and his stomach twisted. The house might be gone, but the darkness hadn't left. It was crawling, seeping into the cracks of the street, dripping from the sky like ink, and the whispers they were still here. It's not over, Carter, his pulse roared, because deep down, he already knew that. 10.2, The mark on his skin. Carter stumbled to his squad car, chest heaving. His uniform was drenched in sweat. Shadow jumped in first, still on high alert. The moment Carter sat in the driver's seat, a sharp pain burned through his wrist. He clutched it, his fingers digging into his own flesh. Something was wrong. His skin was moving, shifting, burning. Carter rolled up his sleeve and his blood ran cold because something had been carved into his wrist, a symbol. Fresh, raw, and bleeding. Shadow let out a low whimper, sniffing the air, like even he could smell the wrongness. The whispering grew louder. You still owe a debt, Officer Carter. You can't run from it. Carter's breath hitched, because when he looked in the rearview mirror, Danny was sitting in the back seat. 10.3, The passenger who never left. Carter's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. His whole body felt frozen. The air in the car was thick, suffocating. Danny sat motionless, his hollow eyes locked on Carter. His small hands rested on his lap, except they weren't hands anymore. They were rotting, flesh peeled away, revealing blackened bone. His mouth was stitched shut again, but Carter didn't need to hear him speak because the whispers in his head said it for him. You let me die, Carter. And now I'm taking you back. Danny lifted his decayed hand and placed it against Carter's shoulder. The moment the cold, dead fingers touched him, Carter's vision shattered. Car 10.4, The past that won't stay buried. Suddenly, he was somewhere else. The squad car vanished, the streetlights flickered out, and Carter was standing inside the house again. But this time, it wasn't decayed and ruined. It was as it had been before. Before the fire, before the deaths. Carter's stomach twisted because he could hear footsteps, not just one set, two. And then, a voice. Get in the basement, kid. Carter's breath hitched because that voice, it was his. 10.5, The truth Carter refused to remember. A door creaked open. Carter turned and saw himself, a younger version, wearing the same police uniform, holding a child's wrist in a bruising grip. Danny, the boy, was crying. "Please, don't leave me here." Carter's chest clenched. "No, that's not me. The younger Carter shoved Danny inside the basement. Danny stumbled, falling onto the concrete. "Be quiet," the younger Carter hissed. "He'll be back soon." Danny sobbed. "Who? Who's coming back?" The younger Carter's face darkened. "The man who owns this house. You have to stay quiet, Danny. If he knows I let you go." Carter's stomach churned. No, that's not what happened." He staggered forward, reaching for the boy, but his hands passed through him like he was watching a memory he had erased. "I tried to save him. I tried to stop it, but then..." The front door slammed open and a shadow loomed in the doorway. A deep, grating voice filled the house. Carter, what did I tell you about touching my things?" And then everything went black. 10.6, the debt comes due. Carter gasped as his vision returned. He was back in the car. His heart pounded violently. Danny was gone. Shadow was whimpering, nudging Carter's hand. Carter's breathing shook, because now he remembered everything. He hadn't just found Danny that night. He had left him there, trapped with a monster. And now that monster wanted him back. The radio in the squad car screeched with static. Then a voice, deep, rotten, familiar. "You didn't think you could leave me behind, did you, officer?" Carter's blood ran cold, because he knew exactly who it was, and this time it was coming for him. To continue in 11. To be continued in Chapter 11, Carter's real nightmare has just begun, because the cursed K9 unit, Chapter 11, The Monster in the Dark, 11.1, The Call from Hell. Carter sat frozen, his breath heavy in the cold air. The squad car's radio hissed with static, filling the silence with a sound that felt too alive. Shadow whimpered beside him, ears flattened, his body tense. The voice from the radio wasn't human. It was wrong, distorted, twisting through the static like 1,000 whispers tangled together. "Did you miss me, Officer Carter?" Carter's fingers dug into the steering wheel. His mouth was dry, his mind screamed, "Run, drive, get the hell away." But something held him in place, the weight of his sins. Danny's rotting face flashed in his memory. The basement, the chains, the monster that lived in the shadows of that cursed house. And now, it had found him again. 11.2, the highway that shouldn't exist. Carter's instincts kicked in. Get out. Move. He slammed the gear into drive, his tires screeching against the pavement. The squad car tore down the empty road. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, stretched shadows that didn't match his car. Shadow sat rigid in the passenger seat, eyes locked on the mirror. Carter didn't want to look, but his gut told him something was there. Slowly he glanced up, his stomach dropped. The road behind him was gone, swallowed by pure blackness. Like the world was rotting away behind him, and in that darkness, something was running. Fast. Too fast, and it was catching up. 11.3, the passenger that wasn't there. Faster. The voice wasn't his. Carter's pulse pounded. He pushed his foot to the floor. The car roared forward, speedometer climbing 60, 70, 90 miles per hour. But the shadow kept up, and then Shadow let out a guttural growl. Carter looked over. His canine partner was snarling at the back seat. His fur bristled, lips curled, teeth bared in a furious rage. Carter's breath hitched. Something was in the car. Slowly, so painfully slow, he turned his head, and his body locked up. There, sitting in the back seat, was a man. At least, it looked like a man. But his face, it was a blur, like something had smudged it out of reality. But his mouth was grinning. Too wide. Keep driving, Officer Carter. You're almost home. 11.4, the town that shouldn't be. Carter's vision swam. The headlights illuminated a road that didn't exist. He should be heading towards the city, but this wasn't the highway anymore. The road had changed. The trees on either side were dead, their branches twisted like skeletal hands reaching for the car. Fog coiled along the cracked pavement, and ahead, a town. A place Carter recognized. His stomach twisted. It was the town from his past, the one that had burned down years ago. But now, it was waiting for him. 11:05, the house that never left. Carter slowed the car, his knuckles white on the wheel. The houses were empty, windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. But one house stood untouched, standing tall at the end of the street. The house, the one he had set on fire, the one where Danny had died. His heartbeat thundered, Shadow whimpered. The thing in the back seat laughed softly. "You never left, Carter. You just pretended you did." Carter's breath shook, because he realized something. He wasn't driving to this place. It had pulled him back. The radio screeched, and then a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Come inside, Carter. Let's finish what we started." The house's front door creaked open. Waiting, welcoming. And Carter knew he had to go in, or this nightmare would never end. To be Canine Unit, Chapter 12, The House That Breathes. 12.1, The Return to Hell. The house stood at the end of the dead town. Its windows were dark holes. Its walls breathed. Carter felt his chest tighten. His past was inside, waiting. Shadow let out a low whimper, pressing against Carter's leg. Even his canine partner knew this place was alive. The air around them was thick, wrong, like stepping into the lungs of a beast. The thing in the back seat laughed softly. "Go on, Carter. You already know what's inside." A memory clawed at his mind. Chains. Danny's screams. The smell of burning flesh. His own cowardice. Carter's hand tightened into a fist. He wouldn't run this time. Not again. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, and the house swallowed him whole. The doors that close on their own. The moment Carter and Shadow entered, the door slammed shut. The air grew thick, suffocating. The walls twisted and pulsed, like veins under diseased skin. Shadow's hackles rose, a deep growl vibrating in his throat. Something moved upstairs, slow, deliberate. Carter's breath shook. The house was watching him, mocking him. It knew he didn't belong here. Not anymore. But it wasn't going to let him go. Not until it was finished. 12.3, The Whispering Basement. The whispers began again. Soft at first, then growing. Hundreds of voices, all speaking at once. He let us die. He burned us. He never saved us. Carter's head pounded. His feet moved on their own. Shadow snarled, trying to block his path, but Carter was already walking. Down the hall, past the peeling wallpaper. Down, to the basement door. It creaked open. Darkness spilled out, cold and hungry. A staircase waited, leading to the place where he had left Danny behind. "Come down, Carter, we've been waiting." The 12.4, The Thing in the Basement. Carter took a deep breath and stepped inside. Shadow hesitated. The dog's body trembled, tail low, ears pinned back. Then, with a soft whimper, he followed. The stairs creaked under Carter's boots. The deeper he went, the colder it got. The whispers became laughter, mocking, taunting, and then he saw it. A figure stood in the center of the basement, small, still, rotting. Danny, his head tilted slightly, sewn shut mouth curling into something unnatural. Then he moved, his body jerked violently like a puppet cut from its strings, and Carter felt something behind him, watching, waiting. "We never left, Officer Carter, and neither will you." 12.5, The Monster That Wore a Face. The air snapped. The darkness rushed forward. Carter spun around and froze. A man stood behind him. But no, not a man. Something wearing the idea of a man. Its skin was wrong, its hands too long, and its face was his own. "Hello, Carter?" It smiled. "I've been waiting to meet you." Carter's blood ran cold, because now he finally understood. This thing wasn't haunting him. It was him, the part of him that had left Danny behind, the part of him that had let the town burn, the part of him that was already dead, and now it wanted to take him home. 12.6, The Final Choice. The walls groaned. The house shook. Shadow barked furiously, fangs bared. Carter stood frozen between the past and the present, between his sins and his future. Danny's rotting body stepped forward. The monster that wore Carter's face did the same. And Carter knew he had to choose. Live or stay here forever. Come home, Carter. Be what you were meant to be. Carter's heart hammered. And then he made his choice. His hand moved to his belt. Fingers closed around his gun. Bang! The shot ripped through the silence, and the house screamed. The walls split open. The whispers shattered, and everything began to fall apart. 12.7, the house that finally died. Carter felt gravity vanish. The floor collapsed beneath him. A howl tore through the air. Shadow lunged, grabbing Carter's sleeve with his teeth, holding on even as the house ripped itself apart. And then silence. Carter gasped for air. His body lay on cold dirt. Shadow trembled beside him. And when Carter looked up, the house was gone. Not burned, not broken, just gone, like it had never been there at all. 12.8, the debt that was finally paid. Carter and Shadow sat in the middle of the empty field. The cursed town was gone. The past had crumbled, and the monster wasn't inside him anymore. Carter's breath shook. For the first time in years, the whispers were silent. Shadow nudged his hand. Alive. Real. The only thing that truly mattered. Carter let out a weak laugh. We made it, buddy. The night was still. No more monsters, no more ghosts, just two survivors, finally free. For the first time in a long, long time. The end. Carter's journey through the cursed canine unit is over, but some nightmares never really die, and somewhere in the places where the world is thin, something still watches, waiting, because debts like Carter's are never paid in full.